Princess Lyraean stood on the black stone balcony and watched the fires burn across 3 moons hanging in the dark sky above her fortress world, and the plasma explosions painted everything in shades of orange and red, while her dragon Night Whisper coiled her massive body around the tower behind her and breathed smoke into the cold night air, and the war had finally reached their doorstep after months of watching colony after colony fall to the Kashari invasion fleet. And now her father, the dying emperor, had made a choice that filled her with rage and shame because he had asked the Galactic Council for help, and they had sent her, a human of all creatures, to be her guardian and protector. The dimensional gateway flared to life in the courtyard below, and Lyraean watched with disgust as a man stepped through carrying worn military gear and weapons that looked primitive compared to elf technology, and he was tall for a human, with scars on his face and arms that spoke of many battles, and his name was Jack Sullivan, according to the data files she had refused to read properly, and he looked up at her balcony and nodded once as if he already knew she was watching him, and she turned away because she would not acknowledge this insult to her honor and her people. Lyraean stormed into the war room where General Theron and her advisors waited, and she slammed her hand on the table hard enough to crack the crystal surface and demanded they send the human away immediately, because she did not need some short-lived primitive ape following her around and pretending to protect her when she had the best warriors in the galaxy and a dragon older than most star systems. And General Theron cleared his throat and reminded her gently that the Emperor had signed the contract and the Galactic Council had approved it, and breaking the agreement now would cost them human military support, which they desperately needed. Jack Sullivan set up his equipment in the outer chambers and ignored the hostile stares from the elf guards who made it clear he was not welcome here, and he had seen this before on a dozen worlds, where the locals thought humans were beneath them until the shooting started, and then they were happy enough to have human soldiers bleeding beside them, and he checked his weapons and his armor and prepared for the inevitable test, because proud warriors always needed to prove themselves against the outsider. The test came the next morning when General Theron summoned Jack to the training arena and told him he must face 3 of their elite warriors to prove he deserved to stand near the princess, and the 3 elves were fast and strong, and their magic made them even more dangerous. But Jack had fought worse, and he used every dirty trick he knew and turned their arena into a trap and used their own confidence against them. And when the first warrior came at him with a blade wreathed in lightning, Jack threw sand in his eyes and swept his legs and took him down hard, and the second warrior used ice magic, but Jack had thermal charges that turned her frozen ground into steam and obscured her vision, and he hit her from an angle she never saw coming, and the third warrior was smart enough to hang back, but Jack was patient. And when the warrior finally committed to an attack, Jack was ready with a human martial art that turned the elf warrior momentum against him. Lyraean watched from the viewing platform above, and her hands gripped the railing so hard the stone cracked, because this human was supposed to fail and be sent away in shame. But instead he fought like someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. And his tactics were strange and brutal and completely effective, and when all 3 of her elite warriors lay defeated in the sand, Jack stood in the center breathing hard and bleeding from a dozen cuts, but still standing. And he looked up at her and smiled. And it was not a mocking smile, but one of simple acknowledgement that he had done what was asked. Night Whisper stirred beside Lyraean, and the ancient dragon voice filled her mind with words only she could hear. And the dragon said there was something unusual about this human warrior, because his spirit burned with a fire that most creatures never achieved. And he had been broken and rebuilt many times, and each time he had become stronger rather than weaker, and dragons could always sense such things because they lived long enough to recognize true strength when they saw it. And Lyraean wanted to dismiss her dragon companion words, but she had learned long ago that Night Whisper was never wrong about such matters. That evening, Jack was given quarters near the princess' chambers, and he sat cleaning his weapons when Lyraean appeared in his doorway without warning and demanded to know why he had come here when he must know he was not wanted. And Jack looked up at her with tired eyes and said he had come because the Galactic Council had asked, and because the Kashari were a threat to everyone including Earth, and because he had lost people to them before, and he wanted to make sure he did not lose anyone else. And there was something in his voice when he mentioned losing people that made Lyraean pause. She asked him who he had lost, and Jack was quiet for a long moment before he said his sister Amy had been in his unit when the Kashari ambushed them 2 years ago, and they had tried to fight, but the Kashari used bioweapons that turned living beings into mindless drones, and he had watched his sister become something else before he was forced to put her down himself, and he had failed to protect her, and he would not fail again, and his hands were shaking slightly as he said it, and Lyraean saw past the rough soldier exterior to the wounded man beneath Lyraean left, without another word. But something had shifted in her mind because she understood loss, and she understood the weight of failing to protect someone you loved, and perhaps this human was not so different from her after all, and she went to Night Whisper and sat against the dragon-warm scales, and admitted that maybe she had judged too quickly, and the dragon rumbled with satisfaction and said that understanding was the first step toward trust. The fortress alarms began screaming just before dawn, and Lyraean ran to the command center where displays showed Kashari warships dropping out of hyperspace by the hundreds and surrounding their world, and General Theron's face was pale as he reported that their shields would hold for perhaps 3 days before failing, and they needed to evacuate the princess immediately. But even as he spoke, explosions rocked the fortress, and someone shouted that infiltrators had sabotaged the launch bays. Jack appeared beside Lyraean with his weapons ready and his armor sealed, and he said they needed to move now, because the Kashari always sent assassins ahead of their main force, and staying in one place made them easy targets, and Lyraean wanted to argue, but another explosion much closer made the decision for her, and she followed the human as he led them through corridors. She had walked her whole life but now seemed full of shadows and danger. They reached her private chambers, and Lyraean was about to retrieve something important when Jack grabbed her arm and pulled her back hard, and a moment later her handmaiden Katie stepped out of the shadows with a knife in her hand, except it was not Katie anymore, because her eyes were black and empty, and her skin rippled with something moving underneath, and Jack fired his weapon without hesitation, and the plasma bolt burned through the creature disguise and revealed the Kashari infiltrator beneath Lyraean, stared in shock because Katie had been her friend since childhood, and the thing wearing her face lunged forward, but Night Whisper was faster, and the dragon tail smashed it against the wall hard enough to crack stone, and Jack kept his weapon trained on it until he was sure it was dead. And then he turned to Lyraean and asked if she was injured, and she shook her head because she could not find words. More alarms and more explosions, and Jack said they needed a plan because staying here meant death, and running blindly meant death, and fighting meant probably death, but at least they could choose how they went down, and Lyraean looked at this human who had been here less than 2 days, and realized he was right, and she was the princess, and she needed to lead. The Kashari Death Fleet blocked out the stars as hundreds of biomechanical warships took position around the fortress world, and their weapons began firing massive energy beams that hammered against the magical shields protecting the planet, and each impact sent shock waves through the fortress that made the ancient stone walls shudder and groan, and Lyraean could feel the shields weakening with every strike because she was connected to them through her royal bloodline, and she knew they had even less time than General Theron had estimated. The War Council gathered in the Emergency Command Center deep underground and argued about what to do next, and some wanted to fight to the last, while others insisted they evacuate the princess immediately, and a few cowards suggested surrendering to the Kashari as if that would save anyone, and Jack stood in the corner listening to them argue. And finally he stepped forward and said they were all thinking about this wrong because they were treating it like they had to choose between fighting or running when they could do both. General Theron looked at the human with irritation and asked what he meant, and Jack pulled up a tactical display and explained that humans had a strategy they used when outnumbered and outgunned, and it was called tactical retreat with scorched earth protocol, which meant they would fall back while destroying everything useful behind them and deny the enemy any resources while buying time to regroup and counterattack, and the elf commanders looked offended at the idea of destroying their own fortress. But Jack pointed out that if they stayed, it would be destroyed anyway, and at least this way they would take plenty of Kashari with them. Lyraean studied the plan and saw the brutal logic in it, and she asked Jack how they would evacuate thousands of people while fighting a running battle, and he admitted that they could not save everyone, and some would have to stay behind to buy time for the others. And the room went silent because no one wanted to say what they were all thinking, which was that volunteers would have to sacrifice themselves. And Lyraean felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders like never before. An explosion much too close made the lights flicker, and someone reported that Kashari drop pods were landing inside the outer walls because the shields were already failing in places, and the enemy was pouring through like water through cracks. And General Theron immediately ordered all combat units to defensive positions. But Jack shook his head and said defense was death because the Kashari would just keep coming until they were overwhelmed, and instead they needed to attack and create chaos and make the enemy think they were stronger than they were. Lyraean made her decision and ordered the evacuation to begin immediately and told General Theron to organize the fighting retreat while she and her guard would lead strike teams to hit the Kashari landing zones and buy time, and the general tried to protest that the princess should not be in direct combat. But she silenced him with a look because she was not going to ask her people to die while she hid in a bunker. And beside her, Night Whisper growled in agreement. Jack checked his weapons and looked at Lyraean and said if she was going into combat, then he was coming with her because that was literally his job. And she started to argue that she did not need a human bodyguard. But he interrupted and said this was not about what she needed, but about what he promised to do, and she could complain about it later when they were not about to die, and despite everything, Lyraean almost smiled at his bluntness. They moved through the fortress halls with a squad of elite warriors, and Jack insisted on taking point because humans had better threat detection in close quarters thanks to thousands of years of hunting and being hunted. And at first the elf warriors resented taking orders from a human, but after he spotted and disabled 3 Kashari traps, they had all missed. They started to listen, and Lyraean watched how Jack moved through dangerous spaces with a confidence born from surviving too many battles. The first real fight came in the main courtyard where 50 Kashari shock troops had set up a staging area for their assault on the inner fortress, and they were massive creatures covered in bio-armor that absorbed energy weapons, and their own weapons fired living projectiles that burrowed into flesh and killed from inside, and the elf warriors charged forward with magic blazing, but the Kashari were ready and cut them down with brutal efficiency, and Lyraean felt rage and grief as her people fell. Jack pulled her behind cover and pointed to the Kashari command node, which was a pulsing organic mass directing the troops, and he said if they took that out, the soldiers would lose coordination for a few seconds, and that would be enough, and Lyraean asked how they would reach it through 50 enemies, and Jack grinned and pulled out what he called a thermite charge, and explained that sometimes the best tactic was not to be clever, but to just blow things up really hard. The explosion vaporized the command node and half the courtyard with it, and the Kashari troops stumbled in confusion, and Lyraean warriors struck with renewed fury, and Night Whisper dove from above, breathing fire that burned hot enough to melt the bio-armor, and within minutes the courtyard was clear, but more drop pods were landing beyond the walls, and everyone knew this was just the beginning, and they had a very long night ahead. Back in the command center, they learned that the launch bays were so heavily damaged that only a fraction of the ships could launch, and that meant most people would have to evacuate on foot through the underground tunnels that connected to other settlements. But those tunnels had not been used in centuries, and no one knew what condition they were in, and Jack volunteered to lead a scout team to check the route while the main evacuation was organized. Lyraean insisted on going with him, despite protests from everyone including Jack himself. But she pointed out that she knew the old tunnels from childhood exploration. And besides, if the princess was not willing to risk the same dangers as her people, then she did not deserve to lead them, and General Theron finally agreed, but assigned her best remaining warriors to accompany them, including a veteran fighter named Selene, who had served the royal family for 200 years. The entrance to the ancient tunnels was hidden behind the fortress throne room, and Lerayan used her magic to unlock seals that had not been opened in generations, and stale air rushed out, carrying the smell of dust and age and something else that Jack identified as biological decay, which meant something had died down there at some point and might still be rotting, and everyone looked nervous. But there was no choice, and they descended into darkness. The tunnels were worse than anyone expected because sections had collapsed and others were flooded, and strange fungi grew on the walls that pulsed with bioluminescence. And Jack warned everyone not to touch anything because he recognized some of the fungal patterns from Kashari bioweapons. And somehow they had already infiltrated even down here, and that meant the enemy knew about the tunnels and would be waiting. They moved carefully through the underground maze, and Night Whisper had to compress her form to fit, which was painful for a dragon. But she endured without complaint, and several times Jack stopped the group because his combat instincts screamed danger, and each time they found Kashari traps waiting, including living mines that would have collapsed the tunnels and buried them. All and the elf warriors started to understand why the Galactic Council had sent this human, because he thought like someone who expected the universe to try killing him. The first Kashari ambush came at a junction where 4 tunnels met, and bio-trackers had been following their heat signatures through the rock, and suddenly the walls burst open and enemy soldiers poured through, and the fight was desperate and brutal in the confined space where magic was less effective, and close combat favored the Kashari superior strength, and Jack used his combat knife and grenades and pure vicious determination to hold one tunnel, while the elf warriors held the others. Selene fought beside Lerayan and protected the princess with centuries of skill, but a Kashari blade found a gap in her armor, and she went down hard, and Lerayan screamed and tried to reach her, but Jack grabbed the princess and dragged her back, because more enemies were coming and they needed to retreat now. And Selene looked at them with pain-filled eyes and said she would hold this junction and give them time to escape. And Lerayan started to argue, but the veteran warrior just smiled and said it had been an honor to serve. The last thing they heard as they ran was Selene's war cry and the sound of explosions as she triggered every weapon she carried and brought down tons of rock to seal the tunnel. And Jack did not slow down and did not let Lerayan stop because grief, later survival now, and the princess hated him for a moment. But she knew he was right, and she ran. They emerged from the tunnels into the scorched wastes, where ancient wars had turned fertile land into an ocean of black glass that reflected the burning sky above, and the temperature was extreme because the fortress shields no longer extended this far, and radiation levels were climbing toward lethal. And Jack immediately deployed portable shield generators he had been carrying, which created a small bubble of safety around the group, but it would not last long with only limited power. Night Whisper stumbled as soon as she tried to expand back to normal size, because compressing her form for so long through the tunnels had damaged something inside, and dragons were not meant to fold themselves that small, and the ancient creature's massive legs shook, and she collapsed onto the glass ground with a sound like thunder. And Lerayan ran to her companion and pressed her hands against the dragon scales and tried to channel healing magic, but she was exhausted, and her power was nearly depleted from maintaining her own shields. During the tunnel fight, Jack scanned the horizon with his tactical visor and counted at least 20 Kashari dropships in pursuit, and they would reach this position in minutes, and the group was down to just 5 elf warriors plus Lyraean and himself, and Night Whisper could not fly, and there was nowhere to hide on the flat glass plain, and this looked like the end of the road, but he refused to accept that because humans were too stubborn to know when they were beaten, and his mind raced through options until an idea formed that was completely insane and might just work. He asked Lyraean if she could channel her magic into human technology and use it as a power source, and she looked confused and said that had never been attempted because elf magic and human machines operated on completely different principles, and trying to combine them might cause both to fail or explode. But Jack pointed out they were going to die anyway, so they might as well try something new. And he pulled out a weather manipulation device that humans used for terraforming and explained his plan. The device was designed to create localized atmospheric disturbances, and if they supercharged it with magic, they might generate a massive sandstorm that would hide them from Kashari sensors, because the biomechanical ships relied heavily on thermal and electromagnetic tracking, and a storm big enough would scatter those signals across hundreds of miles, and the pursuing ships would lose them in the chaos. And Lyraean stared at him and said the amount of power needed would probably kill her, but Jack said not if they distributed it through multiple sources and used Night Whisper as a buffer. They set up the device in the center of their shield bubble, and Lyraean placed her hands on one input node, while Jack connected cables to Night Whisper scales because Dragonhide conducted magic naturally, and the ancient creature rumbled agreement, and then Jack activated the machine, and immediately everything started going wrong as human technology fought against elf magic, and the device began overheating and sparks flew, and Jack had to manually adjust power flows while being shocked repeatedly, but he kept working because stopping meant death. The storm formed faster than anyone expected, as magic and technology found an unexpected harmony and created something neither could achieve alone, and wind began tearing across the glass wastes, lifting black sand particles that had accumulated over centuries, and within seconds visibility dropped to 0, and the wind speed climbed past 200 miles per hour, and the Kashari ships overhead lost tracking and scattered, trying to avoid colliding with each other in the sudden chaos. But the storm was also killing them because Jack's shields could not keep out the wind entirely, and debris slammed against the bubble and cracks formed, and sand began leaking through, and the abrasive particles tore at exposed skin like knives, and Jack saw Lyraean starting to collapse from magical exhaustion, and he moved to shield her with his own body because that was what humans did when they cared about someone, and he took the full force of the storm against his back. Lyraean felt Jack's body covering hers and protecting her from the wind, and she could feel his pain through their physical contact, and without thinking, she extended her remaining magic to create a barrier around him, and suddenly they were both protecting each other, and their powers merged in a way that should have been impossible, and the shield around them stabilized and grew stronger, and Night Whisper watched with ancient eyes and understood what was happening. The storm raged for hours while they huddled together, and eventually the Kashari ships gave up searching and moved on to easier targets, and when the winds finally died down, the group emerged battered and bleeding but alive. And Jack equipment was destroyed, and Lyraean magic was completely depleted, and Night Whisper could barely move, but they had survived, and that was enough. They walked through the cooling glass wastes as the planet rotation brought night and strange stars appeared overhead that Lyraean had never seen from this angle, and Jack led them toward a set of coordinates he had memorized, which he said was a hidden human smuggler base that operated in the border regions, and Lyraean asked why humans had smugglers operating in elf territory, and Jack shrugged and said because there was money to be made, and humans would go anywhere if the profit was good enough. The base was built into an old mining station that had been abandoned centuries ago, and camouflage fields hid it from casual scans. And when they approached, armed humans and several other species emerged from defensive positions and challenged them until Jack identified himself using old military codes, and then a scarred human man stepped forward and embraced Jack and said it had been too long. The man's name was Cole, and he had served with Jack in the Terran Defense Corps before leaving military service to pursue more profitable ventures, and he welcomed them into the base, which was surprisingly well maintained and stocked with supplies and medical equipment. And he took one look at the exhausted princess and injured dragon and started issuing orders to his people to prepare quarters and food and medical care. Lirayan sat in a small room while a human medic treated her wounds, and she could hear Jack and Cole talking in the next room, and Cole was asking what kind of trouble Jack had brought to his doorstep, and Jack explained about the Kashari invasion and the fall of the fortress. And Cole whistled low and said the whole sector was going to burn if the Kashari were not stopped, and he asked what Jack planned to do next. Jack said he needed to get Lirayan to the elf homeworld, where she could rally the remaining fleets and organize a real defense, because right now everyone was scattered and demoralized, and they needed leadership. And Cole pointed out that getting across half the galaxy while every Kashari ship was hunting for the princess would be impossible, but Jack just said impossible was a human specialty, and Cole laughed and agreed to help. That night, Lirayan could not sleep because her mind kept replaying Celine's sacrifice and Katie betrayal and the fall of her fortress and all the people who had died, and she went to check on Night Whisper, who was resting in the station's largest bay. And the dragon opened one massive eye and rumbled softly and said the human had proven himself worthy, and Lirayan admitted she knew that. But she did not know how to deal with the feelings growing inside her. Jack found her there an hour later and sat beside her without speaking for a long time. And finally Lirayan asked him how he dealt with loss and kept fighting, and Jack was quiet and then said, "You never really dealt with it because the pain never went away completely. But you learned to carry it and honor the dead by living and making their sacrifice mean something." And she asked if he still thought about his sister. And he said every single day they sat in comfortable silence and watched Night Whisper sleep, and Lirayan realized she felt safer with this human than she had felt in months, despite being hunted by an entire invasion fleet. And maybe trust was not something you decided, but something that grew when you survived hell together. The attack came at dawn, when someone inside the base poisoned the water supply, and half the people fell ill within minutes, including Cole, who collapsed at his command post, and alarms started screaming, and Jack grabbed Lirayan and told her to stay close, because this was an inside job, and that meant someone here was Kashari, and he pulled out his backup weapon and moved through the base with lethal purpose. Jack noticed that his personal water supply was untouched because he always maintained his own filtration system from years of operating in hostile territory, and that paranoia had saved both him and Lirayan, who had been drinking from the same source, and he watched the pattern of who collapsed and who remained standing. And his combat-trained mind identified the vector of attack and led him to a woman named Linda, who worked in the base medical section. And when he confronted her, she smiled with empty eyes, and her skin began rippling the way Kashari infiltrators did when they stopped pretending to be human. Linda lunged at Jack with inhuman speed, but he was ready, and his weapon burned through her shoulder, and she stumbled but did not fall because Kashari biology was incredibly resilient. And she hissed that the invasion fleet had been signaled and would arrive within hours, and everyone in this base would be converted into bio-drones just like she had been converted months ago, and Jack felt cold rage because he recognized that fate as what had happened to his sister, Amy. Lirayan reached deep into her depleted magical reserves and found one last spark of power, and she channeled it into a binding spell that froze Linda in place long enough for Jack to finish what he started, and the infiltrator body collapsed and began dissolving into organic sludge, and they knew they had minutes before Kashari ships arrived, and most of the base population was incapacitated from the poison. Cole struggled to his feet despite the toxins in his system and told Jack to take the princess and run while they still could, but Jack refused to abandon the people here, and instead he asked Lirayan if her healing magic could purge the poison, and she said maybe if she had any power left, but she was completely empty. And then Cole suggested something desperate, which was that dragons were known to have incredible healing abilities tied to their life force, and maybe Night Whisper could help. They ran to the bay where Night Whisper rested and explained the situation, and the ancient dragon considered for a long moment and then agreed, because these people had given them shelter, and that created a debt of honor, and the dragon began channeling her life essence into the poisoned individuals, and one by one they began recovering, but the effort was draining. Night Whisper rapidly, and her scales began to dim, and her breathing became labored. Lorraine watched in horror as her companion who had been with her since birth began to fade, and she threw herself at the dragon and begged Night Whisper to stop before she killed herself. But the dragon said quietly in her mind that some things were worth dying for, and that protecting life was the highest calling of dragonkind. And besides, she had lived for thousands of years and was tired, and going out like this had meaning. But the healing was not enough, because too many people had been poisoned too severely, and they were still dying, despite Night Whisper's sacrifice, and Lorraine felt despair crushing her because she was powerless to help. And then Jack did something that shocked everyone, and he cut his own arm and offered his blood and said human blood had aggressive healing properties and high platelet counts, and maybe it would help. And Cole stared at him and said that mixing species blood had never been tested and could kill everyone involved. Jack met Lorraine's eyes and said they were out of options and someone had to try. And she understood what he was really saying, which was that he would rather die trying than live knowing he could have done something, and she made a decision that would change everything, and she said if they were going to attempt this insane experiment, they should start with her, because if it failed, she would rather die than watch everyone else die. The process was agonizing as human blood mixed with elf biology and created a reaction nobody predicted, and Lorraine felt like her veins were on fire, and Jack held her hand while she screamed, and Night Whisper added her remaining life force to stabilize the fusion, and slowly the three sources merged into something new, and Lorraine's body began healing itself at an incredible rate, and the poison was purged from her system, and she gasped and sat up, feeling stronger than she had in days. What nobody expected was the mental link that formed between Jack and Lorraine as a side effect of the blood fusion, and suddenly she could feel his emotions, and he could feel hers. And it was overwhelming and intimate and terrifying all at once, and they stared at each other with shock as they realized they were now connected in a way that went beyond anything either species had experienced. They used the technique on the others with more controlled doses, and most survived, and Cole recovered enough to resume command, and he looked at Jack with new respect and said, "Humans never stopped finding new ways to break the rules of biology," and Jack just shrugged and said, "Desperation was the mother of innovation," and Lorraine found herself smiling despite everything, because that was such a human response. Night Whisper lay exhausted but alive, and the dragon opened her eyes and looked at Jack and spoke aloud so everyone could hear, and said he was now Flame-born, which was a title dragons gave to warriors who proved their souls burned bright enough to stand as equals. And it was the highest honor dragonkind could bestow, and no human had ever received it before, and Jack looked uncomfortable with the attention, but Lorraine knew this meant Night Whisper had accepted him completely. The Kashari ships arrived hours later, but the base inhabitants were ready, and they had set traps using human ingenuity and elf magic working together, and the first wave of attackers found the station apparently abandoned and walked into ambushes that combined explosive charges with magical barriers that funneled enemies into kill zones, and the fighting was brutal, but the defenders held because they were fighting for survival and had nothing left to lose. During a brief lull in the combat, Lorraine felt through the mental link that Jack was planning something suicidal, and she confronted him and demanded to know what he intended, and he admitted that the Kashari kept coming because they were tracking something in the base, and he suspected they had planted a beacon during Linda infiltration, and the only way to stop them was to find it and destroy it, even if that meant going outside the defensive perimeter. Lorraine said if he was going, then she was coming with him, because the mental link meant she could warn him of dangers before his human senses detected them, and together they would be more effective. And Jack tried to argue, but she reminded him that she was the princess and technically his employer, and he had to follow her orders, and despite the desperate situation, he almost laughed. They moved through the mining tunnels that connected to the surface, and Lirayan used her recovering magic to sense the beacon energy signature while Jack handled the physical security, and they found it buried in an old equipment room surrounded by Kashari biotraps, and disarming it required precise timing and steady hands, and Jack's hands were shaking from exhaustion, but Lirayan channeled calmness through their link and helped steady him, and together they disabled the beacon. The moment it went offline, the Kashari attack ceased and the ships withdrew, because without the tracking signal, they had no way to locate the hidden base, and the defenders had won at least for now. And Cole declared Jack and Lirayan honorary members of his crew, which he said was worth more than any medal, and they celebrated with whatever food and drink survived the battle. Later that night, Jack found Lirayan on an observation deck looking at the stars, and he sat beside her and asked if she was okay with the mental link, because he knew it was invasive, and she had not asked for it. And Lirayan was quiet for a moment, and then said it was strange, but not unwelcome, because she had spent her whole life with people keeping their true thoughts hidden behind court manners and political games, and it was refreshing to know exactly what someone was feeling. Jack said he felt the same, and through the link, Lirayan sensed his growing feelings for her and her own feelings for him, and they both knew this was complicated, because she was a princess and he was a human soldier, and their peoples had never been particularly close. But somehow none of that seemed to matter anymore, and when he took her hand, she did not pull away, and Night Whisper, watching from nearby, rumbled with satisfaction. News reached the base 3 days later that the elf homeworld was under siege, and worse, that Emperor Lirayan's father had been found dead in his chambers, killed by Kashari infiltrators who had penetrated even the most secure locations, and the council was in chaos trying to decide who should lead, and Lirayan felt the weight of succession fall on her because she was the crown princess, and now with her father gone, she was technically empress, even if she had not been officially crowned. Cole provided them with a fast ship modified with human stealth technology and elf shield generators, which he said was the result of years of smuggling operations that required avoiding both human and elf patrols, and Jack helped prep the vessel, while Lirayan sent encrypted messages to every elf commander she could reach, telling them to rally at the homeworld for one final stand against the invasion. The journey took weeks because they had to use backwater routes to avoid Kashari patrol fleets. And during that time, Jack taught Lirayan basic human combat tactics, while she taught him fundamental magic theory, and through their mental link, they learned faster than should have been possible because they could share understanding directly, and Night Whisper recovered slowly and watched them with ancient eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. When they finally reached the homeworld, they found it surrounded by both Kashari warships and a ragtag collection of elf vessels that had answered Lirayan's call, and there were also human ships present, which shocked everyone because Earth Fleet had no obligation to join this fight, and Jack contacted the lead human vessel and spoke with Admiral Patricia Green, who explained that the Galactic Council had authorized joint operations. And besides, humans did not abandon their allies, especially when one of their best soldiers was involved. Lirayan took command of the combined fleet from her ship bridge, and at first the elf admirals resisted taking orders from someone so young, but when she outlined a battle strategy that combined human aggressive tactics with elf defensive magic, they began to see the wisdom, and Jack stood beside her and provided tactical advice, and together they created a plan that had a small chance of working. The Mao strategy was bold and dangerous and required perfect timing between multiple fleet elements, and it relied on the Kashari arrogance because the biomechanical ships always assumed they were superior and never expected their enemies to do something completely insane, and the plan was to let the Kashari think they were winning and draw them into a trap where concentrated fire from both human and elf vessels would destroy their command ships. The battle began at dawn, when Lyrian gave the order to engage, and the elf ships moved forward in formation, while human vessels circled wide using their superior speed, and the Kashari took the bait and focused their main fleet on the elf forces while ignoring the humans until it was too late, and Admiral Green led her ships in a devastating attack run that crippled 3 Kashari carriers. But the enemy adapted quickly and sent their elite biofighters after the human vessels, and the small craft were piloted by converted beings who had once been living people, and Jack watched the screens and felt sick knowing his sister had become one of these things, and he volunteered to lead a counter-strike using modified elf fighters equipped with human weapons. Lyrian tried to stop him because she could feel through their link that he was planning something beyond a simple attack run. But Jack said this was something he needed to do, and she understood because some debts could only be paid with action, and she authorized the mission and watched him launch with a mixed squadron of human and elf pilots who had trained together during the journey. The fighter battle was chaos, as both sides tried to gain advantage in the space between the capital ships, and Jack flew like someone possessed using every trick he knew, and the mental link with Lyrian gave him an edge because she could sense enemy positions through magical detection and guide him through the chaos, and together they were more effective than any single pilot had a right to be. Then the Kashari revealed their final weapon, which was a massive bioship larger than anything seen before, and it began converting surrounding space into an organic field that would spread and consume everything, and Lyrian felt horror, because if that field reached the homeworld, the entire population would be transformed into Kashari drones, and everything her people had built over thousands of years would be lost. Jack saw the bioship and knew what had to be done, and he armed the experimental antimatter charges that humans had secretly loaded onto his fighter and set course directly for the massive vessel core, and Lyrian screamed through their link begging him not to do this, but he sent back feelings of love and determination and said some prices were worth paying. Through their connection, she experienced everything he felt as he dodged defensive fire and pushed his fighter past safe limits, and the hull began burning from friction and weapons fire, but he kept going, and she felt his resolve and his peace and his certainty that this was right, and she wanted to hate him for leaving her. But she understood because she would have done the same. At the last second before impact, Night Whisper did something impossible and tore through the fabric of space itself, using ancient dragon magic that few even knew existed, and the dragon materialized beside Jack Fighter and grabbed it in her claws and teleported them both away, just as the antimatter charges detonated and the explosion vaporized the bioship and sent shockwaves through the Kashari fleet. The enemy forces scattered in confusion with their superweapon destroyed and their command structure disrupted, and Lyrian ordered the full fleet to attack, and human and elf ships pushed forward together and destroyed Kashari vessels by the dozens, and within hours the invasion fleet was in full retreat, and the homeworld was saved. Jack woke in the medical bay with Lyrian holding his hand and Night Whisper head resting on the bed beside him, and the dragon rumbled that he was the most troublesome human she had ever met, and he should stop trying to die heroically. And Jack laughed weakly and said he would try, and Lyrian punched his shoulder and then hugged him, and through their link he felt her relief, and love, and fear. The coronation happened a week later, and Lyrian stood before her people and accepted the crown and became empress officially, and her first act was to create a formal alliance between the Elf Empire and Human Federation, and her second act shocked everyone because she named Jack Sullivan as her prince consort and declared that he had earned his place through courage and sacrifice, and anyone who disagreed could take it up with Night Whisper. There was resistance from the traditional nobles who thought an empress should marry elf royalty, but Lyrian reminded them that she had just saved their entire civilization, and perhaps they should trust her judgment. And besides, the mental link meant she and Jack were already bonded in a way deeper than any marriage ceremony, and the nobles grumbled but accepted Jack stood beside her during the ceremony wearing formal attire that mixed human military dress with elf royal garments, and he looked uncomfortable with all the attention. But when she took his hand, he squeezed back, and through their link she felt his commitment and his love and his promise to stand with her through whatever came next. Admiral Green attended representing Earth, and she approached Jack privately and said the Terran Defense Corps wanted him back and would promote him to commander of joint operations. But Jack declined and said his place was here because he had found something worth more than rank or glory. And Green smiled and said she understood and congratulated him. The reconstruction took months, and human engineers worked alongside elf builders to repair the damage, and the two species learned from each other and created new technologies that combined their strengths, and trade agreements were signed, and cultural exchanges began, and slowly the galaxy began to change. Leorayan and Jack worked together, governing the Empire and training new forces to defend against future threats, and Night Whisper recovered fully and spent her time teaching young dragons about the value of different species and the importance of looking beyond surface differences. One evening, Leorayan found Jack on their private balcony looking at the stars, and she asked what he was thinking, and he said he was remembering his sister Amy and how she would have liked seeing humans and elves working together, and Leorayan held him and said they would honor all those who were lost by building something better, and he agreed. Through their mental link, they shared dreams of a future where species cooperated instead of competed, and where strength came from unity rather than dominance, and they knew it would be difficult, and there would be setbacks, but they had already accomplished impossible things, and Night Whisper wisdom and their combined determination would see them through. The alien princess had not wanted a human guardian, but he had become the one who saved her life and changed her world. And together they built something neither could have created alone. And the galaxy watched and learned that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships became the strongest bonds, and that was a lesson worth remembering.